Final segment on today's Jefferson Exchange. I'm Jeffrey Riley. Thanks for listening. Today marks the anniversary of the day the Pony Express ceased operations in 1861. The telegraph replaced it, and the telephone replaced that, and then came radio and TV and so on. Now we live in a media-rich world of instant communication, and a couple of educators from our region help us understand it in our Signals and Noise podcast. Jessie Kretzer-Hartenstein is an assistant professor in journalism and mass communication at Cal Poly Humboldt. Chris Lucas is an assistant professor of communication at Southern Oregon University. They're here to talk about media choices, media coverage, and more in Signals and Noise. Who do I have, Chris or Jessie? Jessie, you here? Chris, you here?
Hey, nice to be here.
There we go. There's Jessie. Okay, good. We do have one of you. We're working on getting Chris on the other line, so it'll take just a moment. But Jessie, I want to start talking about Israel and Gaza and the war so far and what is coming up and the media coverage of it, because there's just so much to talk about there. Why don't you give me your general take first, and we can get into some specifics.
Yeah, I think, just from that media perspective, it really is a sort of a prime example of the fog of war in relation to media, of just all this misinformation and disinformation, and it becomes really polarizing, as we've seen. And so, the tragedies that are happening are important enough and huge enough on their own, but then they just get sort of really amplified in this, media world that we live in these days, with how fast media technology is spreading these messages. And so the fake news has been so rampant. It's just astonishing to me.
And is it coming from both sides? And what are the avenues of distribution?
Yeah, so both sides, traditional media and social media and everything in between. We're seeing it from each side. It's sort of a propaganda war, right, of winning over the hearts and minds of people around the world to kind of support each side. And so we're seeing a lot of disinformation even just coming out of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and from the Israeli government and Netanyahu, and then also from the other side, from Gaza and Hamas, the messaging that's being put out there, really trying to gain support for their side, which, is kind of understandable, but then the way that it's being spread through traditional media, where we're supposed to have gatekeepers and fact checkers, that's been kind of it's been a little bit alarming. We've even seen some of our main news outlets putting out information, like, for instance, about the I hesitate on which words to use, bombing versus missile attack versus, what context is going to, what context are we going to give this about the hospital? Mm-hmm. And which side actually was the perpetrator on that. And we saw, as I was mentioning, some of our main, American news outlets like Reuters and the AP and MSNBC, Politico, New York Times, all putting out information right at the beginning, right when that happened, saying that, or at least initially they indicated that the blast came from an Israeli airstrike. And those reports really were coming straight from the Hamas health ministry. And so they ended up, going back and kind of changing their headlines around once we realized that, well, maybe that's what happened, but maybe not. But that need for speed on getting the information out there, we kind of bypassed a lot of the normal gatekeeping and fact checking that these, presumably trustworthy media outlets would usually abide by. And then we're also seeing that on the other end with social media. So these messages are getting out there, and then we're amplifying it on social media. And some of it is the amplification of those kind of traditional news media stories. But then a lot of it is opinion or fake news. We saw some examples of social media posts going around claiming to be from the conflict or war. And again, I keep catching myself with which word am I going to use because of the framing of this, and I don't want to be part of the problem in amplifying messages that aren't 100% accurate. But we saw video game clips claiming to be images and videos from the war. We saw clips from past wars and past conflicts from years ago claiming to be this current conflict. So just lots of misinformation and disinformation, both in traditional media and social media.
Chris Lucas is with us now as well on Signals and Noise with Jessie Kretzer-Hartenstein from Cal Poly Humboldt. Chris Lucas is from Southern Oregon University. Chris, what's your overall impression of what you have seen thus far in the coverage of the Mideast war?
Oh, wow. Great to be with you. Sorry I'm a bit late. I'm not sure what Jessie's been talking about, but it sounds like it was very much about just the overwhelming kind of tsunami of misinformation. And, we know the war in general is the enemy of quality information and impossible conditions, right, for gathering information. And you lay that on top of a lot of information operations by, not just the combatants, but all kinds of, operators around the world. And it's just a really difficult situation, the so-called fog of war. I think, one thing there's been a lot of discussion of sort of media cultures in these parts of the world, and one thing that it's been a little lost, like outside of, for instance, Israel, is a lot of focus on, the government there, but inside of Israel is like a really, a pretty properly adversarial media culture. There's a lot of like discourse and debate within Israel. Even as, we definitely see both in that country and around the world, a lot of pressure being put on media outlets and reporters and like lessening access to leaders and not enough press conferences and these kinds of things we really need to question our leaders. But, from people I've talked to and things I've read, it seems like there is still pretty healthy debate going on that we just aren't really seeing as much of it outside the country.
I wonder. I want to hear a little bit from each of you about just the reporting on what got us to this point. Trying to explain who Hamas is and what Gaza Strip is and all that stuff seems to take up about half of the coverage, at least in the print media. Jessie?
Yeah, I want to speak to that. Before I do, though, I also want to just point out that, I'm surrounded by people that are paying attention to news and media, and even a lot of these very educated people that I know have no idea of the context, even though it is being covered. Yeah. And that's just been astonishing to me. And I think part of it is because it is so complex. The clashes in the Middle East and Israel and Palestine and these regions, this goes back to biblical times, right? So to understand all the intricacies and nuances, it is challenging. And I think a lot of people kind of end up having that information overload. But we have been seeing it. And we get some of that information about, the 75 years of occupation or the 1947 UN partition plan that kind of went awry, and that was where the UN had decided to create two independent states and then have Jerusalem under the UN administration. But as we know, Israel declared independence in 1948. They took over more of the land than they were supposed to, according to the UN at least. And, we see we've been hearing a little bit of both sides of that. And so much of that is depending, in all the context and all the history, it's there, but there's still different ways of framing that and different ways of telling those stories of the history. And I think that's really contributing to these kind of the different understandings that people who are paying attention and aren't having the information overload are still having these very different versions of history and therefore very different versions of where we stand today and kind of which side they fall on. And so much of that, getting back to the media coverage, so much of that is just in, who's telling the story, who's telling that history. And depending on which media outlets you're paying attention to, even something that we kind of look at and say, well, that's history, we know the facts, it's being told very different and, with a different framing and a different lens on it. And so I think there's still a lot of kind of confusion in all of that as a result.
Chris, is this kind of the old media nutrition situation where we're getting too many calories and not enough nutrition?
Oh my gosh. It is a little bit of, there's a lot of, fast food out there, for lack of a better analogy. David Folkenflik on NPR a few days ago said something I thought was really important to remember, that we're still in this environment where readers are rewarding outlets that put the information out instantaneously. And this is counterproductive dynamic here. And we really rely on journalists and editors that kind of pump the brakes as necessary, because this is an extremely documented conflict. Putting aside the misinformation problem, but just the amount of documentation going on, and it's we're in this media environment of immediacy and the mobility of information and images and the spreading these graphic images. And it's all very much presented with the lack of the context that Jessie's talking about, right? That, sort of pick your historical scale here, and it's just going to get more and more complicated. And, one thing we talk about in my classes a lot is just, how persuasion is very much a part of our media environment now. And a lot of what you're seeing is, even if it feels that it is sort of fact-based, there's often an attempt, or at least a goal or an intention here of persuasion and thinking about the ways we're being persuaded.
Let's see if we can get the coverage of Congress and the election of a speaker covered in about 2 minutes with Jessie and Chris here. Here again, a lot of stuff to talk about, but in the end run, after 3.5 weeks of an empty speakership, we have somebody now in Mark Johnson. And give me your thoughts, Chris, on the coverage of it all and what might have been lacking in it.
Well, I mean, this was a high drama situation that's just irresistible. It's like catnip, I suppose, especially to congressional reporters. Rumors flying around. Some people in the know, and a lot of assumptions. I think. I mean, they're the savviest viewers. These reporters who are trying to do it, but they're serving an audience of pretty savvy viewers, news junkies, and I think really getting fixated on that drama in a way that I think is kind of counterproductive. I think of the reporter, the journalism professor, Jeffrey Rosen, who's in the past said, reporters should be covering the stakes, not the odds, like not the horse race, but why it matters. And I think that's something really good to keep in mind.
All right, Jessie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with Chris on this one. That while there were really kind of important things happening, a lot of the stories that I was coming in contact with were more about the drama, right? If it bleeds, it leads kind of. So let's find that dramatic aspect in there. And so I honestly, again, I pay attention to a lot of news media and I teach journalism for a living. And I was even kind of confused on what was really going on because so many of the stories were not about the facts that we needed to know. It was more about how can we sell this story and get people, to get excited or get upset or whatever the emotions were that, that we try to evoke when we tell stories. And one thing that I didn't see covered much that I thought was interesting in the lack of coverage, at least, in the stories I was coming in contact with, was the what was really going on the Democratic side of it. With the Democrats versus the Republicans, it was more about the fight than about, okay, well, what's really happening here? And I had to go seek out, information and stories so that I could have a better understanding of it. So I'm assuming that, most of the American public was probably missing a lot of that as well.
Okay, yeah. Certainly the Democrats were staying out of the spotlight there for a while consistently voting for Hakeem Jeffries to be Speaker, and he often beat the person who was going for the Republicans, but that didn't get covered that much. So we have a little less than a minute to get pick three in from both of you. Chris, why don't you whittle off your pick three media choices for the month?
Okay, kind of quickly here. I've been enjoying this really kind of sassy satirical mystery series on Prime called Deadlock, which is Australian. Very fun. I also really liked listening to Alan Alda's podcast, Clear and Vivid, because he just is a great conversationalist, especially his recent conversation with the biographer Walter Isaacson, which is really about Elon Musk. And then Errol Morris, the great documentarian, has a film that just premiered on Apple TV called The Pigeon Tunnel, about David Cornwell, who's better known by his pen name in John Le Carré, the mystery writer.
Okay, so all right, we'll put those up online. Jessie, quickly, your three.
My first is super general. It's just I have been trying to, and I want everyone else to try to pay attention to news outlets that have a different perspective than your own. And maybe we can avoid some of this misinformation if we start gathering news from different sources. My second one is a website to go in line with that, which is PolitiFact. And I may have mentioned this before, I don't recall, but it's really just a fact-checking website. And I encourage everyone to check that out before you start spreading, before you repost and amplify messages online. And then my last one is just a fun one, because in the midst of all the this chaos and mayhem, I really love to garden and cook from my garden, and I've been loving this cookbook, Love and Lemons, Simple Feel-Good Food by Janine D'Onofrio.
Okay, great choices on both sides. Jessie Kretzer-Hartenstein from Cal Poly Humboldt, Chris Lucas from Southern Oregon University. Thank you so much. That's it for today's Exchange. We're online at jeffexchange.org. Angela Decker's our producer. Zach Beagle's at the controls. I'm Jeffrey Riley. Thanks for listening. Please join us next time and have a great day.